Eric, you
Omar.
know, at
Oh,
what?
yeah.
Oh, it's just the leg. No, we're always in
the-
simpatico, my friend. Ever since we saw Hereditary, and we looked in each other's eyes, and there was an emptiness, and so there's a longing, and we helped fulfill that in one another.
Yes.
It
Without
does.
your soul, I'm incomplete, and vice versa.
Yeah. I didn't want to state it in such certain terms, but yeah, let's go there. Okay, we're the Iron Brotherhood. Iron Culture is just an excuse for us to communicate with
Iron Cult.
Sure, it's coming soon.
Yep.
Stay tuned. For us just to stay in communication with one another and use this whole subterfuge of having a podcast as a big excuse. But for those that have been listening for a long period of time and the Brotherhood-Sisterhood continues to grow every single week, they would know that we're about getting maximally jacked with minimum function, which is why this is an interesting episode. I'm not sure why we have it. We do have two very smart individuals that clearly explain or try to explore the relationship between strength and hypertrophy and the different components of strength. But why are we having this episode, Eric?
Yeah, I think it's an important one because, bodybuilders, powerlifters, can they be friends? Well, that comes down to whether hypertrophy and strength can be friends. And that's what this podcast is about. I think what we effectively did with Iron Culture with this episode is we got two really intelligent individuals, Andrew Vygotsky and Greg Nuckols, and we thought, you know what? I looked at Omar and I said, hey, we're not the smartest monkeys in the barrel. We're not the sharpest tools in the shed. I'm not even sure if all my tools in the shed need to be sharp. I mean, that's a wrench. Should I be
sexy.
sharpening this?
Yeah.
But nonetheless,
I've never used tools in my life before. I'm a modern man.
Absolutely. So whether tools are sharp or not, who knows? I don't fit gender roles.
Right.
But we tried to get some people who were just above us in terms of level of IQ, got them on the podcast, and we're thinking, hey, they can reach down and pull us up and can elevate everyone in terms of their IQ. Quickly realized that they were so far above us, there's no way they could reach us.
Andrew in particular.
We let them talk. Yeah. Oh, wow. You just heard Greg.
No, because I've never spoken.
Done.
I've never spoken with Andrew Vygotsky before. And this how he approaches a problem, and actually, it might be, I think he has a degree in engineering, but it's not just that. It's how he thinks about an issue before approaching it is something that all of us, and actually what's interesting, Eric, we have an upcoming episode talking about kind of assumptions or coaching or the Dunning-Kruger effect, where it's very much in play. We see a lot in the fitness industry. Just how to reframe and think about things can really help you arrive at a better answer if there is to be an answer. So no, it was an absolute pleasure having these two individuals on. I was not throwing anyone under the bus. It's not my fault that Vygotsky is part of the Borg. It just is. You know?
Yep.
He just is.
So like you said, while you just threw Greg underneath the bus, I totally agree that these are some great guests, and I'm really pleased that Andrew's on because Andrew has not only published. So those who don't know, there is some controversy in the scientific literature as to how great, or even whether or not, hypertrophy is a significant contributor to strength. So we wanted to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of that a little bit. The first thing we did was we just went through what contributes to strength and where hypertrophy falls in line with that. And then we got really into the nuts and bolts of the contribution. And the cool part about Andrew is that he is primarily not an exercise scientist. He does have a biomechanics background in his undergrad, but for his postgraduate work, he's done work in statistics, he's done work in neuroscience, and he's actually published on both sides of the kind of the aisle of the debate here. He's published with Jeremy Lenicky, who is largely pointing out a lot of the times when hypertrophy does not seem to relate to strength. And then he's also published with others who are pointing out the counter-argument. And I think because he's outside of exercise science, he has a very unbiased view, a very nuanced view, and like you said, he gets right back to first principles. So it was really cool to have him on. And then, of course, we've got our second repeat. Greg Nuckols is back on, who
He's a
really
monster.
has the applied side.
Yeah.
He's a monster.
Yeah, and I think so we really get deep in this episode. I think perhaps I'm just going to be bold in my statement that this is perhaps the most in-depth podcast that people will actually listen to on the discussion of strength and hypertrophy, but it's also understandable thanks to Eric bringing it back down, and Greg helping explain a lot of these different concepts and how they apply. So not only do we have a theoretical framework that we talk about when it comes to strength and then how it relates to hypertrophy, but also a lot of practical applications. So I think it's the best of both worlds. If you feel at any point in this episode you might be getting a little lost, don't worry, we'll ground it back for you, and Eric does a fantastic job.
Thank you, brother. Let's get into it.
Wow, we have another episode that is going to be an absolute banger. Before we begin and introduce our guests, Andrew and Greg, I just want to say, Coach, I'm standing in solidarity with you while you're doing your prep. You're 2 weeks out from your second show. I'm drinking some ginger beer that's Zivia, so it's 0 calorie, and I'm just trying to be, aware of not consuming any food or drinks around you, and it tastes terrible, but it's for you. I just want you to know that.
Well, I appreciate that. Completely unnecessary, but the solidarity is respected, my Peach Boy brother.
That's kind of iron culture in a nutshell. Completely unnecessary, but the solidarity is there amongst us, amongst our guests. We actually have our second person who's back on for the second time, Greg Knuckles. The first one, Dominic Moraes, more A's than B. When we're doing the history of lifting, we're now talking about strength and hypertrophy, the relationship. We have 2 guests, one of them who will not identify what's in his closet, but I'll let them introduce themselves.
Yes, we're definitely scraping the bottom of the barrel now. We've had Greg on twice.
Yeah.
So, but hey, at least it's, sometimes in certain food containers, the best is at the bottom, and it's got that flavor all just congealed and welled together. So Greg, please, for those who don't know, tell us about the congealed flavor at the bottom of the Iron Culture barrel that is Greg Knuckles.
I like to think of myself as more like the bottom of a Doritos bag.
Perfect.
Specifically, the what is it? Like the cheddar one? The cheesy one? Anyway, Cheeto dust or Dorito dust.
They're all cheesy.
Best stuff in the world. That's how I personally think of myself on a spiritual level.
Yeah. Hey, I think unlike Omar, you just made me hungry. Omar's here with diet soda. You're making me think about like between classes in high school and getting my hand all orange. And okay, I'm having a moment here. So,
I'm not gonna lie,
Eric, it's gonna be okay.
Since I had any Doritos, and I still think about how good Dorito dust is.
They are pretty amazing. So, Greg, tell the listeners who have been living under a rock more about you than Dorito dust comparisons. Maybe something a little more concrete, and then we'll move on to our less dusty second guest.
I'm a powerlifter. Also train people for powerlifting. Also write about powerlifting. Have a website called Stronger by Science, and am 1/3 of a monthly research review called MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, along with Eric Helms and also Mike Zordos. So I think that's the crux of it. And
I would also point out you're I think you're a graduand, not a graduate.
Correct.
Yet of your master's degree in some exercise science topics. So congratulations to that.
Thank you.
Master Greg.
Thank you.
Master Knuckles.
Love it. That's right. Awesome. And you've also been the author of a really good, I think, back and forth that we're going to discuss in more detail between you and Lenicky and his colleagues, looking at the contribution of hypertrophy to strength and what it means for something to contribute and be a factor of something else. And I think that'll be a cool discussion that we'll dig into later. But before we do that, Andrew Vygotsky, welcome to Iron Culture. Honor and a privilege for us to have you on. Please share with our listeners a bit about who you are and just the meaning of what it is to be you. But more so the first part.
The wonder of you.
Okay, so I'm a PhD candidate in biomedical engineering at Northwestern. I'm also on the tail end of a master's in biomedical engineering and a master's in statistics. Before that, I did my bachelor's in kinesiology down at ASU, where I also did research with Brett Contreras, and I did some post-bac research with Brad Schoenfeld as well. So most of my previous work is in the area of neuromuscular biomechanics. And now I've actually made the transition. I'm more in computational neuroscience, but I still follow a lot of this literature and still publish in these areas. So it's more of a hobby horse of mine.
And the real question is, do you even lift?
I was thinking the same thing.
Occasionally, but I'm training for a triathlon now with my bike. That's not true, but...
Which isn't true? That you occasionally lift, or that you're training for a triathlon? That was too ambiguous for me. I want to nail you down. This is like a McCarthy-esque interview. Like, do you lift or not?
Yeah. What do you identify as? Greg's a powerlifter. What are you?
I mean, if you can't tell, does it really matter?
Okay.
Oh, wow. Okay. Existential.
Wow. Okay. We got a murderer on our hands. This is fantastic.
Well, I will point out that that you're no stranger to the iron sports, and there have been times in your life where you at least did lift. So,
yes.
Yeah. So as you know, as someone with education, from Einstein saying it, there's no such thing as time or something like that. It's all relative. So therefore, you currently lift. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that's an exact quote from E equals MC.
Yeah.
Relativity.
Yeah, what Eric's trying to do is keep your reputation for our casual listeners that hear Greg and they're like, sure, okay, Greg, yes, he's a powerlifter. He likes talking about powerlifting. He's in the game. What's his skin in the game? Well, he gives a damn about the sport. And you're kind of like, yeah, I'm pursuing a lot of different things, degrees. You know, I'm kind of so beyond this, but it's still a hobby horse of mine to talk about lifting. And so Eric's like, yeah, but you're still in the game, right? Like it's that trying to keep that legitimacy of each guest. So you're in it. We got you.
You know, so I may not. So yes, I do lift occasionally. I don't compete or anything like that, or I have in the past. But
did you hear that, folks? He's competed in the past.
But I'm not a coach, and I don't have as much skin in the game as you guys. But that could also be seen as a good thing. I don't have as much of an agenda as you guys know, and I don't mean anything negative by that, but just that.
What? Because we're all sponsored by Big Creatine? Is that what you're trying to say?
That means I have nothing to lose by saying things. So,
damn.
What I will say is, I have been in the same room as every person on this podcast, and at least as of 2016, I would say Andrew probably had the biggest arms of any of us, which honestly I think is the only thing that matters.
Wow.
Boom.
Wow.
You and with that statement right there, you've just secured your returned iron culture at some point.
Andrew, welcome back. We're having you on again.
And trust me, the thing is, when you start saying smart things on this podcast, there's going to be a certain percentage of our listeners who just start to slowly back away, start to take their headphones out, and they're like, this is hurting me. And then when they hear he's got really the biggest arms in the room, they're going to go, all right, and then they go back in. So the good news is, see, that's the thing. It's not about having an agenda. It's about we need people to listen. The bros and the sisses who you might intimidate with your fancy words, now they're going to listen. Okay? All right. So I think, first off, thank you both for coming on. And in all seriousness, or at least some seriousness after all that not seriousness, it's I think you guys are two leading minds in this field. Not necessarily purely from a research perspective in terms of Greg, or it not being your primary focus in terms of Andrew, but both of you have had some really unique perspectives in the way you think about strength and the relationship and what it's informed by, I think is really useful. So I think you're a great duo for us to have on, and I'm excited to talk about this. Where I'd like to start, and Greg, I'll kick it off to you here, is if we can talk about all the things that go into strength. And I think we probably want to talk about it in the concepts of how a lifter would think about it. Like what are the main buckets that inform, let's say, a 1 rep max?
Sure. So there's a lot of stuff. Starting at the very, very most basic level, some people just have muscle fibers that are stronger per unit of cross-sectional area than other people. Probably related to like actin and myosin packing density, but in single fiber studies, like some people, when you hook their muscle fibers up to like a force transducer and stimulate them and see how much force they produce, some people just simply have muscle fibers that produce more force per unit of cross-sectional area than others. And in research looking at how that's called relative tension, studies looking at how relative tension changes with training tend to find that either it doesn't change at all or it doesn't change much. So that seems to be a relatively inherent characteristic where people just differ. Moving beyond muscle fibers, different people, like their muscles will be able to produce more force based on both size and then also something called normalized muscle force. Same thing as specific tension, but on the whole muscle level. So that's, again, force divided by cross-sectional area. And that has to do with both how strong the fibers are and then also probably how efficiently force is like transferred from the fibers to the tendons to produce movement at joints, and that might have to do with intramuscular connective tissue. And then, now we've just talked about how strong like the muscles themselves are, and then those muscles have to be able to create joint moments. So that's going to have a lot to do with like what the internal moment arms are, and the longer the internal moment arm is, the more that contractile force is going to lead to large joint moments to lift heavy external loads.
And in layman's terms, what is a joint moment?
So think about it like this. If you're going to tighten a bolt with a wrench, if you grab near like the business end of a wrench and try to tighten that bolt, you're going to have to pull really, really hard to tighten it. If you grab further out towards the end of the wrench, you don't have to pull quite as hard to create the same rotational force to tighten that bolt. And that illustrates the muscle moment arm. So a short muscle moment arm is grabbing closer to the business end of a wrench, and a longer muscle moment arm is grabbing further away from the business end. So you have to produce less force to create the same rotational torque. And then, past that, then you're talking about things like technique, you're talking about neuromuscular efficiency, you're talking about general motor patterns and all that stuff. So all of those things contribute. Some of them are more trainable than others. In terms of how people adapt to training, there's variability in all of those things. So some people have, for example, large increases in normalized muscle force in response to training. Some people have smaller increases. Some people have bigger increases in muscle size due to training. Some people have smaller increases. Some people have pretty decent motor skills the first time they get under a bar. So just improving in technique and honing that neuromuscular efficiency may not do all that much for them because they're just naturally coordinated and athletic. Some people not so much, and so they have a lot of room to improve there. But all of those things contribute to strength, and all of them vary in terms of how the degree to which they adapt and how quickly they adapt between people.
Well said. Andrew, is there anything you want to clean up bat for Greg there? Anything you left off the table that you think is worth mentioning?
Sure. So I think within movement specificity, so during dynamic movements, the physiological properties of muscle are also going to play a huge role. And the physiological properties of muscle, namely the force length and force velocity relationships. So these are going to interact with the moment arm. So if you have a larger moment arm, that will lead to greater shortening velocities for the same angular velocity. So the way that these things are transferred and affect the physiology, it's all going to interact, and it's going to be somewhat complex and unpredictable, but it's just another thing to consider in that each movement and each muscle and each joint is going to do things differently.
So
things
talk
are
to
going
me
to be
about
affected in different ways. Great, go ahead.
No, that's great. So talk to me about what the force length and force velocity relationships are in terms of how that would apply to expressing strength.
Sure. So the force length relationship, it has to do with the degree of overlap between actin and myosin filaments. So you're going to be able to generate more force if the sarcomere is at about 2.6 microns, where there's optimal overlap. And then as you tail off in either direction, so if the sarcomere gets longer or shorter than that, you're not going to be able to create as much force.
So essentially what you're saying is that if I have let's say my arm is fully extended or fully contracted, the overlap between the contractile components of my muscle are not going to be able to cross bridge effectively and produce as much force as if they were at an optimal length tension relationship. Is that an accurate representation?
So the thing is, where optimal is, it's not necessarily when the muscle is halfway through your joint range of motion, and it's not necessarily while you're at resting either. So each muscle is going to have its own relationship relative to the anatomical position, relative to its range of motion. And there's some theories, so if you look at like Rick Lieber's work from the late 90s, you'll see that it's muscle dependent, and that different muscles have different length tension relationships relative to their resting position and range of motion to kind of optimize and complement function.
So
it also shifts with training, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some evidence for that too. Yeah.
If you train at long muscle lengths, do more eccentric training, etc. But I guess the point is that there is an optimal length tension relationship at any given joint for the muscles that cross it, and that's going to contribute to the force produced in a given movement. So then, what is the force velocity relationship as it applies to production of force?
Yeah, so there's a hyperbolic relationship between force and velocity. So if you're doing a very fast eccentric contraction, you're going to be able to produce the most force. Then that's going to decrease as you get to isometric, and then once you get to concentric, that force is going to decrease very quickly. So you can't generate a lot of force if you're doing a very fast concentric contraction.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So not only does the relationship between the actin and myosin fibers affect force production in any given joint and all the joints that contribute to a compound movement, which is probably what we're kind of primarily thinking about, let's say a 1RM squat, but also the speed and rate of which you lower and try to lift the load, which is also going to be intrinsically tied to how much is on the bar. So yeah, I guess the take home for the listeners, there's a lot of moving pieces that go into a dynamic multi-joint movement. And sure, that gets limited to some degree once you're talking about a 1RM, and there is only one speed that can be completed at for a given individual. But a lot of moving parts here. And then going back to Greg's point, some of it's trainable, some of it's not. One thing that I have often repeated and that a lot of good strength coaches repeat is that strength is not just a characteristic of the body, but it's a skill. So I think it's useful to talk about strength, at least to start, in the context of it being applied through some movement pattern, be it a squat, bench, deadlift, snatch, clean and jerk, what have you. So insofar as we consider strength a skill, what are some of the aspects of that are trainable, and how much does that have an impact on how strong someone can be? Gregory.
Oh, since this is more like neuro stuff, I figure Andrew would probably be the best one to lead off here.
And he punts.
It's my computational neuroscience is actually in pain and neurocognitive stuff.
And he punts right back. Look at this. It's a tennis match.
Fitting totally the serial killer description of studying pain. Go on.
So I'll let Greg start off.
Sure. Okay. So
this volley is vicious. Love it.
So one place where it's somewhat arguable whether things adapt or not is just purely how well muscle fibers are recruited. The reason I say it's arguable is that's probably easiest to study in the context of like a single joint isometric contraction, looking at something called percentage of voluntary activation. And with that, we see that at least for like healthy, undiseased populations who aren't in pain, people are capable of recruiting virtually all of their motor units, even without prior training experience. The reason I say it's somewhat controversial is it's hard to know whether they can actually do that in the context of a dynamic exercise early on, because you can't do percentage activation research on untrained individuals, or on dynamic movements, I mean. Just because like you just can't, like, you don't want electrodes hooked up to your quads when you're trying to squat, and then like as you're trying to grind out a 1 rep max, it like shocks you like that. That's probably a good way to die. So,
However, you could probably sneak that past an ethics board if they're not too aware of what you're actually doing. So it's all about how you write that IRB up, folks.
Sure.
I wouldn't trust any data from that though, but
yeah, there would be way too many things uncontrolled. So it's possible that like just when someone tries a movement for the first time, they can't control it well enough to actually end up being able to recruit all of their motor units in order to produce force. I think that's something that probably happens, but it's not necessarily an issue with necessarily being able to recruit their motor units. It's more an issue of like not having enough skill with that exercise to be able to recruit the motor units for that exercise. And then just like patterning improves as well. So, you know, are you moving efficiently? Are you keeping like center of pressure properly over your foot, et cetera, et cetera? And then this is also somewhat controversial, but one of the classical things people say is that activation of agonists and relaxation of antagonists will increase. So, for example, in the bench press, you want your triceps doing a lot of stuff, and you probably don't want a ton of activation of your biceps because that would then counter what your triceps are trying to do. It's not entirely clear that actually happens in like the sort of multi-joint movement someone would be doing in the context of like powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman. Most of that research is, again, just looking at single joint stuff, but at least in the context of simple movements, that's an adaptation that occurs as well.
So I think there's some important stuff you got out there. One is the way we might measure force output at a given joint in the lab is through an isometric, so a non-moving contraction, non-dynamic at a given joint position in a single muscle. So that might be, having, it's a terrible example, but let's say you had an immovable object at about 90 degrees from your elbow and you're trying to curl it and it doesn't go anywhere, and we're measuring your maximum voluntary isometric force output for the biceps in that midpoint of a curl or something like that. That is entirely different than what might happen in an applied setting where we might have someone do a mock meet and work up to a 1RM and a squat, bench, and a deadlift, because bicep curls are a simpler movement, and even more simple is not having to even do the curl aspect and just contracting your muscle in a given position. And we've got research that's out there, even not looking at isometrics, but comparing. There's a specific study I'm thinking of. I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but they had a pre, mid, and post test, and it was untrained women doing bench press, leg press, and bicep curls. And they saw strength gains in all three at the midway point and the post test, but only hypertrophy adaptations at the midway point in the bicep curl. And the authors postulated that they did not have the motor skills to actually exert enough force to produce morphological adaptations by the midway point, except in the simpler movement, the bicep curl. So we can see this kind of playing out in the real world as one example there. So I do think it's important to differentiate between how a biomechanist in the lab might measure force output at a given joint and how an applied strength and conditioning coach might try to figure out how strong my athlete is in something that's a little closer to human performance, quote unquote. So,
yeah, and another thing just to note is in terms of like the neural stuff in general, the simpler things are, the more we know about them, because there's a ton of different confounders in play, and if you really want to know like what individual motor units are doing, you don't want a ton of movement going on. You don't want velocity to be different. Like strapping everything in, fixing a joint angle, and doing isometric contractions is great. And then like the more dynamic and the more complex things get, the more sources of interference and the more confounders you have going into the system, and the harder it is to really make like nitty gritty observations about what's going on a very, very basic level.
Got it.
Yeah. So in addition, the measures of voluntary contraction. So what they do is they put electrodes on your muscle, and or over the nerve, depending what type of setup it is, and they kind of crank up the current until you feel pain. And then they'll just crank it back a little bit, and they'll use that for the experiment itself. So these people know that, so it's until it depends on the experiment, but how much pain the person can tolerate, essentially. So this person knows that this painful stimulus is coming while they're trying to do a max. So there's some confounding within these experiments, and then you also have to wonder, well, if they scaled this back, are they really recruiting all of the alpha motor neurons, or is it just enough so they don't also stimulate A deltas and C fibers? So within all of these experiments, there are a lot of limitations, and the measurements tend to be pretty messy. So it's hard to study this stuff even in the most controlled setting that you can think of.
So Andrew, if I could clarify to make sure that the listeners are understanding the cool way of measuring voluntary activation, you've got someone with electrodes that are measuring the muscular activity they're producing during a given movement.
Stimulation.
And then you're also stimulating them and trying to look at the difference between those two. Is that
so with voluntary activation, what you'll usually do is you'll measure the actual torque that they're producing.
Okay.
Since there will be a bunch of confounding variables as you're stimulating the muscle, because electrical current will also travel.
Right.
Yeah.
So generally, what will happen is, like, say you're doing like isometric knee extension, you'll have someone kick out against something as hard as they can. You're looking at a screen, you see force go up, and then when they reach maximal force output, it'll plateau. And then at the plateau, then you deliver the shock, essentially. Like, you have the evoked potential. And then you basically look to see how much further that, like, boosts the force that the quads are producing.
Right. And which tells you how much, quote unquote, like, neural reserve there is, basically. How much more you should be able to get out of your muscles if you could voluntarily activate them more. And that's
right. And for most healthy people without injury or neuromuscular conditions, like, that's pretty close to 100%, like 95% plus.
With the caveat, like you said before, that most of these measurements are being done in isolated, simple movements. So this may not be the case, where if someone is doing a complex movement like a squat or a bench or a snatch, where they have to coordinate a lot of joint movement, where they may not have maximal voluntary activation everywhere, that could elicit a higher 1RM because it's requiring more complexity and coordination.
Correct.
Got it.
I actually have a question for Andrew, related to the different components of strength and how to, try and optimize things for the individual. Greg is a huge proponent, as we know, of starting strength, and I just noticed that all these components of strength are not listed in starting strength. So one, I guess the question would be, is any of this verifiable by science? Because, it's things like climate change where we just don't know. People have opinions on climate change. We don't know if it's real or not. But all these components, I don't know what your position is on starting strength.
Holy shit, dude. You come in and you make an explicit reference to starting strength and climate change denialism, and the last time I'm on here, you don't let me make a now that my 3 mandatory informational video for the days are done reference. This is some bullshit.
This is bullshit.
I feel very discriminated against.
Because Greg Ripito is a very influential figure when it comes to strength, and I think it's relevant to the discussion, whereas the person you're referencing is irrelevant in any context at any point in time. No, but in all seriousness, Andrew,
oh man,
all these components that Greg eloquently listed, when it comes to strength, how then does the individual, when it comes to programming, because we also want to talk about specificity and programming in general for the individual, how do you contextualize all this then when it comes to trying to maximize strength? So we're getting all these feelers, maybe listeners are understanding the strength is more complicated than they would think. It's like, oh, just lift some weight. How then, for the individual, how does this start to apply some of the stuff that we're talking about?
Well, if you start to understand the mechanisms and you understand the movements for which you'd like to increase strength, then you can start to think about, okay, how can these mechanisms fit together to increase my actual strength? So if you know to some extent a muscle's increase in size may be associated with an increase in strength, maybe you want to increase the size of those prime movers. If you know that skill is going to be a component and that skill is likely going to be more specific to the weight range that you're interested in, you probably want to practice the movement in that rep range. So I guess the question is, in what context do you want to increase strength? And then from there, you kind of pick apart the mechanisms by which you can increase strength and try to exploit those mechanisms to do so. I don't know if that's very helpful.
No, I think for most people listening, if they do want to pursue strength, it is in the big three. And I think, depending upon where you are in your lifting career, the priority or the hierarchy does change, where what a beginner should focus on is different than an intermediate, which is different than an advanced lifter. And those are kind of not arbitrary distinctions, but there is a difference. If we take a look through a lifter's career, how would those change then, starting from someone who is a novice all the way up then to an advanced lifter? And anyone, Greg, Andrew.
So I think that for a novice lifter, like basically just practicing the exercises you want to get better at is going to give you like the vast majority of the utility you could hope to get. Most of the adaptations you're going to get early on is just going to be learning the movement and improving motor patterns. You're untrained, so you're probably going to grow, and the exact details of the stimulus you're providing probably do make a difference, but ultimately don't matter that much because you're probably going to grow at least some, kind of no matter what you're doing. And I think like the load probably needs to be sufficient in terms of like percentage of 1 rep max to cause the connective tissue adaptations that increase normalized muscle force. So I think that, just generally training fairly heavy, like, not doing sets of 15 to 20, but, like reasonably heavy weights, like sets of 10 or below, and just trying to progressively increase resistance as strength increases primarily as a function of motor skills improving. Then past that point, so one of the things we see somewhat in the research, but also if you've coached people, like, pretty well, is that at least for relatively simple movements, so for example, squat, bench, deadlift, it doesn't take that long for people to get at least proficient at the exercises. And then past that point, like just continuing to train is going to further hone motor skills. If someone is aiming to compete, it's probably not a terrible idea to start doing more like heavy singles in training, so you'll be ready to like put that skill forth on the platform. But like at that point, the hypertrophy that you would get just from doing any sort of resistance training has probably petered out, and you're probably going to get pretty good bang for your buck in the long term by trying to maximize just how much muscle you have on your frame. There are certainly some exceptions like John Hack, but for the most part, the folks who are the most competitive, like in terms of like world-class powerlifters in their weight class, tend to be shorter than the typical lifter in their weight class, just simply because like at that point, like the muscle mass you have is a greater proportion of your total weight. And so like it's just that's going to make you more competitive in the sport of powerlifting. So I think that once those like early neural adaptations are taken care of, then you'd probably want to start focusing more on hypertrophy. And then once you start approaching like your theoretical like muscular limit, or at least like once you reach the point that the amount of effort you have to put into gaining any extra muscle is very disproportionate to like the actual utility you get out of it, then it may be time to start focusing more on training as like practice again, because you're probably not going to be able to put that much more muscle on your frame, and so you're just trying to eke out like the final few like neural adaptations you could hope to get to like fully master that movement. So that's kind of the model that I work with, like just basic practice initially, then more focus on hypertrophy, also with some heavy singles mixed in for intermediates who might be interested in starting to compete, but have a long way to go to reach their muscular limits. And then once someone starts approaching their muscular limits, then the focus shifts back to skill mastery again. And obviously all of those things are intermixed, but in terms of like primary focus, kind of moving in and out of it that way.
Interesting. So I think the question also becomes, what does that specific practice look like? Because I think if we look at all the different systems of both powerlifting and weightlifting training, there is a spectrum there. To someone uninvolved in strength sport, it all looks quite similar. You're all doing, everybody's doing pretty specific training in the context of broad sports science, compared to what a team sport athlete's doing. But if you were to say, compare the Bulgarian system versus West Side, and then talk to someone who's within the powerlifting community, they would perceive that as being starkly different, even if an S&C coach for a different sport wouldn't see them being that far apart. Why not just simply train the lift in its competition form all the time? If we have powerlifters and weightlifters who have a very specific thing they do on the platform, they work up to a 1RM, they don't have to juggle all these other things that most other athletes do. Why wouldn't one just train and attempt new 1RMs on a regular basis? And is that viable? And might that be viable for some and not others? What's the pros and cons here?
So I think one reason you wouldn't want to only do that for the entirety of your training career is just at some point you do need to build some muscle, and just doing 1RMs is probably not the best way to maximize hypertrophy. And by probably not, I mean it's not. So you would need to do at least something else mixed in. And then beyond that, honestly, I think I'm going to give a wishy-washy answer here. I think it's mostly a matter of finding the specific methods that work for specific athletes. So for example, I did something very closely resembling the Bulgarian method for powerlifting. So working up to maxes on squat and bench, multiple times per day, every day. And it worked really, really well for me. And I've also seen it work really, really not well for other people. The Shaco system obviously has worked really, really well for a lot of people. He's the most decorated IPF coach ever. A lot of people have tried similar methods, or even I know a few people who I don't know if they were coached directly by him, but kind of in his system and didn't do quite as well. And then they tried other things and those things worked well for them. So I think a lot of it, beyond just the simple tenets of volume needs to be sufficient to spur adaptations, and it probably needs to be heavy enough that it is fairly specific to 1 rep maxes. I think as long as those big factors are taken care of, then it's primarily just a matter of troubleshooting for that lifter and coach and figuring out what overall type of system works well for that lifter. Because this is actually somewhat based on research. There's a study by Bevan back, I think, in 2009 or so. And it was really, really short term, but I think it was 2 4-week blocks of training in a crossover fashion. Tested people with 4 different, 4 different set and rep schemes, and looked to see what their acute testosterone to cortisol response was, and tested half of them with the one that produced the best T to C ratio for 4 weeks, and half of them produced the worst T to C ratio for 4 weeks. And then after 4 weeks, they flip-flopped, so they crossed over, and the group that initially trained with the program that gave them their worst T to C response switched to the one that gave them their best, and vice versa. And at least in the short term, the groups training with the set and rep scheme that produced what would theoretically be a beneficial acute hormonal response did a lot better, both in terms of strength, and they didn't measure hypertrophy. They just measured scale weight as a proxy for lean body mass, as a proxy for muscle size. So very wishy-washy there, but it seemed there was quite a bit of divergence in terms of what set and rep schemes those individuals responded best to. More recently, in 2015, there was a study by Jones et al. Where they genotyped people, and through a proprietary algorithm, which I'm incredibly skeptical of, they matched people to different training programs based on what their genes predicted they would do well on. So I think it was more strength power stuff versus more strength endurance type stuff. And they also saw the same sort of deal. So people who were put on a program that matched their genotype did well. People who were put on a program that didn't match their genotype did poorly. And again, like I said, I'm pretty skeptical of that paper because it's a proprietary algorithm, and the people carrying out the study were at least like one or two of them were part of like the R&D department for the company that developed that proprietary algorithm. So whatever, conflicts of interest, but there is at least like some research suggesting that, yeah, like the stuff that different individuals respond to can probably differ pretty substantially.
So it sounds like a better question is not where should we fall on the specificity continuum, but rather how do you determine where an individual should fall on the specificity continuum at a given point in their career, and are there any generalizations we can make about that? Why might someone do better following the Bulgarian system versus something more akin to a conjugate system? What are the pros and cons of each?
That's a good question. I mean, so one approach is just blind troubleshooting, where you put someone on a program for like a long enough period of time that if they're going to do well or do poorly, you would be able to fairly see. So maybe like 4 to 6 months. And then like, maybe if 2 to 3 months in, they're doing really poorly, you're like, okay, like abandon ship, this clearly isn't working. And just kind of run them through some stuff and see just kind of off the bat, like what do they like? What do they respond well to? And then use that as a starting point to kind of iterate instead of testing like completely different things. Another approach that initially I kind of hated when I heard about it, but the more I think about it, the more it grows on me, is Mike T's emergent strategies idea, where instead of testing over like a broader, like, 4 to 6 month time span, you test people with like just a microcycle of training and see how they respond week to week. Because I mean, that does kind of make sense. Like it's, if someone's going to do well over 4 months on a training program, it would be pretty unlikely that it would take 2 months for you to see that it's working pretty well for them. So that's kind of a similar approach, but you're changing things out on a shorter time scale. But yeah, I mean, whatever it is, I mean, I think it's for the time being, I think it's primarily a matter of troubleshooting. I wouldn't be shocked if in 10 years there were better screening tools where, maybe there were like independently validated gene tests where you could just look at, oh, what's your genotype? Like, what does your, like, what your proteomics look like? Like, maybe we can predict some stuff from that. Or just like basic testing. So are you someone who naturally has more strength endurance, or more velocity, but worse strength endurance, and kind of like use that as a predictor? But we're nowhere.
Or even psychometrics.
Yeah, or right? Psychometrics.
Where someone's preferences for novelty might impact how they like to train and respond.
So at the time, for the time being, I don't think we're anywhere close to that point. I could see things going that direction in the future, but I mean, for the time being, I think it's just a process of organized troubleshooting.
Right. And I love that you said that. There's a lot of individual factors that go into why someone might respond to a given system of training, to the point where we can't discriminate them all. We may very well one day. Therefore, all we can do is try to do our best logical form of trial and error, which is essentially what coaching and programming is. And that's another reason why you don't want to hitch your horse to any given system or rigid belief system, because we have enough examples in the field to where we see that many different pathways to strength work, and it's very difficult to say what works better or why on an individual level.
I slightly regret getting that West Side tattoo on my lower back, but not really, after what you guys said. I just want to know if, Andrew, if you have any insight on what we just discussed over the last little bit. I saw you nodding. I saw big biceps Andrew Vygotsky thinking to himself, oh, you mere mortals, if only you knew my secret serum.
I mean, I don't really follow programming systems too closely. I don't know a whole lot about them. I'm far from a coach. I'm much more interested in the science and mechanisms of things. So that being said, I do appreciate the point that Eric brought up, especially about psychometrics. And I mean, this is something we've published on before, at least with cross-sectional work about like self-efficacy, for example. I've also been on a paper about the role of autonomy in training and that kind of being a motivating factor. And I guess the underpinning of what I'm saying is that if somebody doesn't really enjoy what they do, or they're not really motivated to do what their coach prescribes, then who cares if it's the most perfect system in theory? It's never going to work in reality. So I'd much rather have somebody on a suboptimal program that they're much more motivated to do than something that might be a little bit better, but something that they find boring, or that they're not really going to stick to in the best way that they could.
That really links in nicely with some of the conversation we had with John Kiley and Mike Toucher, and the potential a role of maybe one of the ways in which some of the auto-regulatory strategies can provide benefit, as they do line up nicely with that self-determination theory kind of model of why humans like what they like and do what they do and keep doing it, in that you're putting a lot more competence and autonomy in the hands of the lifter, and that can have kind of a compounding investment return over time as they become more and more aware and not have so much of a like top-down coaching strategy. So I think that's a really good input. I think it makes sense from what we know about human motivation thus far, and I would love to see how that could be explored in the future. So yeah, we've uncovered a lot here. We looked at the neuromuscular side of things, and how that interplays with specificity, and discovered that also has to do with behavior and psychology of the individual. And we know genetics come into play. I think we can start to shift now towards something you guys have both touched on, which is the morphological, or the actual changes structurally to the body, and how that can impact adaptations as well. And this is something that in certain circles and in different time points in the research, if you look back on it, is something that has been either postulated to play a very large role, down to a minimal to almost negligible role that you shouldn't worry about as if in programming. So I guess let's start with what are the different morphological adaptations that can contribute to strength. We did talk about some myofibril packing density. We talked about normalized muscle force. We talked about hypertrophy. We talked about force transmission, and how well muscles can pass force along to one another. I think when you talk to the average S&C coach or an average powerlifting coach, they typically think of strength as three things. Like there's neuroscience, gobbledygook, fun stuff. They might throw out the word rate coding and then quickly go to the next topic before you ask them a complex question. They'll say how big your muscles are, and then they'll say motor learning, or skill or technique, depending on who you're talking to. Is that an accurate way of kind of putting those three buckets in there, or is hypertrophy way too general for the type of structural adaptations that can impact strength? Or is hypertrophy even the dominant factor that might impact strength from the structural side of things?
You can lead off on this one. I felt like I talked 80% of the time for the last question.
That's fine. So do they classify it as hypertrophy or structural adaptations, or do they just kind of group it all as one?
I'd say the average coach would say just hypertrophy, skill, and neuromuscular. That's probably what they would say.
So I think because I'm going to touch more on the hypertrophy here, just because that's what I'm more familiar with. But I think within hypertrophy, or within the muscle itself, there's so many different other things that can be going on besides hypertrophy that will affect the actual force that the muscle can produce and transmit to the tendon, to the point where hypertrophy itself is kind of, I wouldn't say that's all encompassing. So for example, the point about force transmission. So there's both intramuscular force transmission and also lateral force transmission that's outside of the muscle, so between muscles. And these will affect how force is transmitted differently. So, for example, intramuscular force transmission would be if you think of a single myofiber and how that connects to other myofibers. That there's some work from the 60s suggesting that that plays a huge role in just the sheer amount of force that's transmitted. Force transmission between muscles will affect the length-tension relationships of the corresponding muscles. So there's some work starting to be done there, but with all the force transmission stuff, it's extremely difficult to study, so we don't know a whole lot about it. But that's kind of independent of hypertrophy. That's just kind of passive connective tissue. So that's not encompassed by muscle hypertrophy itself. We also have, like the paper I published back in 2015 with Chris Beardsley and Brett Contreras, muscle hypertrophy itself will affect the moment arm of the muscle. So that's more of a mechanical adaptation, and it's a downstream effect of hypertrophy. How that contributes isn't completely clear yet, but we had some simulations, and I believe we showed it could contribute what most people would probably consider a substantial amount. I think it was like 5.5% for a 30% increase in muscle size or something. I can't remember exactly.
So what we're talking about there, just for the listener, is that muscles don't grow in a vacuum. If you and you can kind of visualize this in your head right now, if you think about your bicep getting bigger and then the tendon inserting onto the bone of your arm, the tendon angle will change as your biceps grow, and that actually changes, therefore, the leverage or the moment arm, like Greg described earlier, of the bicep exerting force on your humerus, which can change how force is produced.
Yep, exactly. And it's not completely clear what role that plays, especially with dynamic movements and with different muscles and different joint angles. So that simulation study was just on a single muscle, two muscles at a single joint angle. But if you think, well, if I flex my elbow way past 90 degrees and I contract my bicep, that is going to your tendon's going to become more parallel with your forearm. So that's going to decrease the leverage. So it will have different effects depending on the muscle, depending on the joint angle. In addition, where was I going with this? Oh, yes. So hypertrophy itself will take different forms. So you can have in-series hypertrophy or in parallel hypertrophy. So muscle fibers can get longer, and that would be beneficial to its force-velocity relationship. But that may be detrimental in terms of, if you just want to do an isometric and you're interested in isometric strength, that won't be very beneficial. You're also going to get different effects on the pennation angle, depending on how depending on how sarcomeres add to the muscle and depending how things pack into one another. So with different pennation angles, you can fit different amounts of fibers within the same muscle volume. So for example, if you add more sarcomeres in parallel and not in series, then you can get greater physiological cross-sectional area.
Mm-hmm. Talk us through pennation angle real quick, just so the audience knows what you mean.
Okay, so pennation angle is the angle of each individual fiber relative to the aponeurosis of the muscle. So the aponeurosis is what connects the muscle itself to the tendon. So if you have a smaller pennation angle, then the fibers are more parallel with the aponeurosis or the tendon, which means more of that force is going to be transmitted into the tendon. But if you have a larger pennation angle, that allows you to pack more muscle fibers in parallel, but there's this trade-off where not as much of that force is going to be transmitted to the tendon. So there are all these trade-offs in terms of the morphology of the muscle, where it's not quite straightforward if that increase in muscle size itself will contribute to a change in muscle strength. So not all hypertrophy is equal.
Right, which makes sense. It's got to fit in there somewhere, and again, it changes the actual morphology of the muscle when it is hypertrophied. So carry on, my friend.
I think that's all I had. Yeah.
Coach, that kind of echoes. Yeah, go on.
One other thing just to throw out there is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is back on the table, which I will say it's strange to me that it ever left the table, because I feel like it was fairly clearly shown by McDougall and colleagues back in like 1982. But then people just kind of stopped studying it, and just over time it became an idea that people just assumed was bro science, but whatever.
Look, as we know, absence of evidence is evidence of absence, and
Sure.
and the only evidence I take is what I can read in a PubMed abstract. So,
but yeah, so sarcoplasmic hypertrophy was pretty clearly shown by Cody Hahn and his colleagues pretty recently, like within the last month or two.
and Greg, what is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and how does that differ from myofibular?
Yeah, so to try to be as precise with the definition as possible, within a muscle fiber, you have your myofibrillar proteins, that's your actin, myosin, the actual contractile machinery. And then you also have your sarcoplasm, which is literally everything else. So you have like the actual fluid that everything's in, you have your organelles, everything else, bunch of enzymes. Anyway, so if you have kind of just like proportional hypertrophy, as the size of a muscle increases, the proportion of the volume of the muscle taken up by myofibrils shouldn't change. If you have disproportionate myofibrillar hypertrophy, you would see an increase in muscle size with a disproportionate increase coming from the myofibrillar proteins. So, let's say 40% of the muscle volume was myofibrils before hypertrophy. After hypertrophy, now it's 45% of the total muscle volume, so you have a disproportionate increase in the myofibrils. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy would be the opposite, so you have an increase in muscle size and a disproportionate increase in that volume taken up by the sarcoplasm. So if muscle size increases, like if cross-sectional area of the whole muscle increases 20%, but the volume of the sarcoplasm increases by 30%, then you would have a disproportionate increase in sarcoplasm, and so that would be sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. It was assumed, contrary to the McDougall study, that as muscles grew, that it was kind of proportional, that the ratio of sarcoplasm to myofibrils didn't really change as muscle size increased. But now we know that it is at least possible for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy to occur with a disproportionate increase in the volume of the sarcoplasm relative to the increase in size of the muscle. And so theoretically, the type of hypertrophy you get should influence the amount of strength increase you can expect, because ultimately it's the actin and myosin interacting that produces the contractile force. And so if you have like a proportionate increase in myofibrils with the increase in muscle size, you should expect contractile force to increase proportional to muscle size. If you have disproportionate sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, you should potentially expect normalized muscle force to decrease a little bit, because the actual proportion of the muscle taken up by the contractile machinery is decreasing.
Got it. And then the question from an applied perspective is to what degree is that trainable, and how large are those differences from the way we train, which we probably don't know, but it does make sense intuitively and logically that if one was to train in such a way that would cause a lot of adaptations in the organelles and the enzymes and the buffering capacity and basically the quote-unquote fuel cell of a muscle, rather than the actual quote-unquote engine, the contractile component, that you would expect to gain less strength but maybe similar or greater size than if one was training in a way that really just focused on force production without having much of a quote-unquote fuel demand. Would you guys agree with that?
So far, the studies that have demonstrated sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, all they've done is like put people in a training program and then see like, oh shit, this happened. It's not like testing two training programs against each other to see like which one causes more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. So the assumption that like high rep, like strength endurance style training would cause disproportionate sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and like heavier, lower volume training would cause disproportionate myofibrillar hypertrophy. That's still just an assumption. Like that's never actually been tested.
It makes sense logically. It seems intuitive. It wouldn't surprise us, but it could be wrong.
Correct.
What Eric wants to know, and I see what Coach is saying.
And one thing I'll note is there is at least some acute evidence against that idea. A study, I think the lead author may have been Bird, but I'm pretty sure the study was out of Stu Phillips's lab, looked at myofibrillar versus like combined muscle protein synthesis following high load and low load training, and found that the total protein synthesis and myofibrillar protein synthesis were pretty similar, both training with, I believe in that study, if memory serves, it was like 30% 1 rep max and 90%. So, obviously you can't necessarily assume that acute muscle protein synthesis is going to then map onto long-term adaptations, but we do at least have some acute evidence against that idea.
And it's probably important to note that most of the studies where they've compared high load versus low load are to failure.
Yeah.
And I think that might come into play just based on what we know about motor unit recruitment. But yeah, Andrew, did you want to chime in there?
Well, I was just going to say, so with Cody Hahn, I and a few others published the paper just on the construct of muscle hypertrophy. So bringing this back to the original point, perhaps a better word rather than hypertrophy would just be structural adaptations, right? And then relating that back to hypertrophy itself, there is disagreement as to what is hypertrophy. So like Greg just spoke about a ton, the sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar. But then there's also, if you're taking these gross measurements of an entire muscle, you can do that in a number of ways. And you can even do it indirectly. So you can use ultrasound to get thickness of the muscle. You can use an MRI to get the volume of the muscle or cross-sectional area of the muscle. You can use things like DEXA or to get lean body mass as a kind of a very gross measure, along with some bioelectrical impedance measures and a few other things. But all of these measurements do not necessarily strongly correlate. So the question is, you talk about hypertrophy, but what is hypertrophy? And
that's something we talked about a good bit on our Hypertrophy Roundtable that just came out, where we had some of the authors of that paper, along with Schoenfeld, discussing how you measure it, you get different outcomes. So some of these issues where we don't see any or a strong association between hypertrophy and strength, well, hey, we don't even see strong associations between hypertrophy and hypertrophy. So it's kind of it may be something that is an artifact of our ability to measure it at this stage.
One thing I'll note though, and I think what actually made me aware of this was a YouTube video you made one time, Eric, is that in the studies that look at the association between changes in some measure or proxy of muscle size and changes in strength, the relationship you tend to see is that as training status increases, you tend to see a tighter relationship between hypertrophy and strength, such that in untrained people, there's virtually no relationship. A popularly cited study by Atienen et al., like the R-squared value between changes in size and changes in, I believe, leg press strength was like R-squared of like 0.036 or something. So like change in one accounted for 3.6% of the variation of change in the other, which is virtually zero.
Can I give a circular shout out real quick here? So that YouTube video that you watched that probably contributed to the awesome article that you wrote, before I made that video, Skyped with a guy named Andrew Vygotsky and talked about all the components and strength and kind of had some peer review before I went and did that. So just a little circular shout out.
God, get fucked, Omar. What did you do?
At Iron Culture here, I don't know if you're aware, Greg or Andrew, but really what we're asking when it comes to the hypertrophy question is that we're all about getting maximally jacked with minimum function. And so Eric was trying to just explore that idea of how we could get more swole and in fact get weaker over time in our tendons, our ligaments, everything just aches and hurts us, and it becomes a problem with how we're building muscle. So that's what we're about at Iron Culture. So we're really exploring a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I'm really looking into doing a BFR on a space station.
Hell yeah.
With isometrics only, to see if I can come back and have a less than body weight bench and squat, but still be jacked. That's kind of the goal. So it's a little hobby.
Anyway, so moving forward. So
you're saying you watched my amazing video and
big fan of Eric's channel.
Just talk more about my YouTube channel.
So in studies on untrained people, you tend to see not much of a relationship there, which makes sense because changes in normalized muscle force, like those are happening, and it varies between people. Just changes in motor skill, that's happening very rapidly, and the degree to which it happens it varies a lot between people. And those are the factors that are probably accounting for the majority of the strength increases in relatively new lifters. So we see that hypertrophy isn't very predictive of strength gains in that population. But then as training status increases, what we tend to see is that, one, we can probably assume that most of those like non-hypertrophic structural adaptations have mostly occurred already, and just developing like basic proficiency or mastery with the motor patterns being tested has probably more or less happened already. And then with more advanced lifters, since those things have more or less been accounted for already, we see a stronger relationship between hypertrophy and strength in those populations. So it's still not like a one-to-one relationship, which you wouldn't necessarily expect, because like we've been talking about, any way we measure hypertrophy is going to be a pretty messy measure. But things start looking a little better. So instead of like R values of 0.1, we might see R values anywhere between like 0.5 and like 0.8 or so. So, something closer to like 25 to maybe 60% of the variation in changes in strength can then be explained by changes in however you're measuring hypertrophy. So, yeah, I think that's pretty logical. So kind of to bring this full circle, like we started with, there's a ton of things that do contribute to strength, but those adaptations take place at different rates, like on different time scales. And one of the slower things is hypertrophy. So you can develop basic proficiency in an exercise pretty quickly, but it can take, years and years to start approaching your like theoretical, like genetic muscular limit. And so a lot of those other things that do contribute to strength aren't fully taken care of within the first few months of training, but most of those adaptations, or at least like a large proportion of them, have taken place during the first, 6 months, a year of training. Whereas in your first year of training, you may have only accomplished 20% of the hypertrophy that you're ever going to accomplish. So then once those other adaptations start occurring at a slower rate as you get more trained, then one of the major drivers, if not the major driver of strength moving forward, is probably hypertrophy, namely increases in contractile proteins within the muscle to distinguish it from sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So I think that is probably explaining the increased strength of the correlation between strength and hypertrophy as more and more trained populations are tested.
So that's really interesting, because now I'm thinking of all the different things that go into why it's a messy relationship to look at. So for one, the relationship changes within an individual over the time course of them getting stronger, just related to how the time course of these adaptations are. Two, in research, we're going to have a mixture of populations examined and often not differentiated in the interpretation. And we're going to have a lot of stuff on untrained or recreationally trained individuals and not a ton of stuff on well-trained individuals. But Andrew, this is something that I thought you did a really good job with, is how we actually measure that correlation statistically can also change things. So really briefly, can you talk us through how we probably should be looking at this association and to get a good insight into what it really means?
Yeah, so the way I look at it is there are two distinct questions here that different statistical methods will answer. So the first being, do those who increase in size more also increase in strength more? And then the second is, as an individual increases in size, do they also tend to increase in strength? So one is kind of more on the individual level, and one is kind of on the group level or between individuals. And the way that a lot of classical correlations are done, especially within this literature, is they look at the group question. So do those within a study, do the individuals who get larger also get stronger? And I think that's the less interesting question. The other way of looking at it requires a lot more sophisticated statistical modeling. And that's why I think only 2 studies have done it now. The first was a study by Jeremy Lenecke's group, which I actually suggested they look into, and they carried it out. And then so Brad Schoenfeld, myself, and a couple of others from University of Queensland reused data or reanalyzed data and did it with even more sophisticated models. So the idea being individuals can have the same slope as they increase in size and increase strength, and different individuals can have different slopes. So that to me makes more sense, because if, let's say, Eric has a 30% larger biceps moment arm than I do, then I'd expect strength to increase at a 30% faster rate. So our analysis showed that that accounts for a lot more variance than both these between subject models and having the affine assumption or parallel assumption that Lenecke's group published. So yeah, actually knowing the statistics and knowing that you're answering the question you wish to answer also makes a huge difference.
Right. So a group level relationship between changes in size and changes in strength is not the same thing as your relationship between strength and size, or the rate at which that association changes over the course of your career as you hypertrophy. And that also requires you have to have a midpoint, right? You can't just have a pre-post when you're looking at it that way, which is something that not a lot of applied sports science papers have when they only last 8 weeks. So I think that's really useful stuff. I'm sensitive to everyone's time commitment, and we've been talking a lot. I want to open it up to both of you to basically add anything we think that we haven't covered, specifically on the relationship between hypertrophy and strength, and things we can do to better uncover it in the future, and maybe look at better statistical models to understand it, because it is very, obviously we can't differentiate them completely. So how do we answer this question moving forward?
So I think what Andrew just said there was really, really good. And I think that is probably the most appropriate type of model to study this moving forward. I would just like to take a stab at hopefully explaining it with a little more clarity, because I know, like, I've tried to explain this to people before and I could tell that they weren't understanding what I was saying. So just to make it a little more clear for the listeners, basically, if you take 2 people who are very, very differently gifted for gaining strength. One of them has like high normalized muscle force, like they have a large density of myosin in their muscles. They have a lot of that intramuscular connective tissue that helps with force transfer. They have long muscle moment arms. If they get stronger, or if they gain muscle, they're probably going to get very, very substantially stronger. You take someone who is less gifted in all of those factors. They have less myofibrillar protein packing density. They have less of that connective tissue within their muscles that helps with force transfer. They have shorter muscle moment arms. When they increase in size to the same degree, they're not going to gain as much strength as the first person does. But basically, if person 1 and 2, their muscles increase in size by 10%, person A may get 30% stronger, person B may get 5% stronger. And there you'd see, like, oh, this is looking like a pretty weak correlation between changes in size and changes in strength. But if you add another time point, they get 10% stronger again. Person A now gets 28% stronger and person B gets 6% stronger. You're like, oh, well, between these 2 time points, we're seeing pretty similar increases in size and pretty similar increases in strength within these 2 individuals. That helps account for the innate differences between them, and is probably a better look at what the actual strength of the correlation is by doing a better job of taking into account those inherent differences. So yeah, like Andrew said, that's still a very uncommon way to look at it in the literature, but I think that in terms of the mathematics, like it's what makes the most sense. It's just going to take more time and effort because it does require mid-testing in the study. And it also takes researchers who understand statistics better, which is a non-trivial hurdle as well. But yeah,
at least in sports science.
Yeah. So I think that is
as one who resembles that statement, I can agree.
Yeah. So I think that is a good way forward, and it'll just be a matter of getting people on board.
I like that. You know, another thing that I think might help people, and I don't think this will take too much time to go into, was you guys got into the nuance of what it means for something to contribute to something else. It's not so simple as if A doesn't go up, B doesn't go up, therefore no relationship. There's different types of the way something can contribute to something else. Could you go through those? I think there were 3 ways you discussed in the paper. That might be also helpful for the listener, just to kind of understand the nuance to the ways that hypertrophy might contribute to strength.
Sure. So there are different types of causality within philosophy. The first is a necessary cause. So a necessary cause would be if, in order for B to happen, A must occur. So if A doesn't occur, then B won't happen. So in this case, it would be, I cannot gain strength unless I also gain size. So clearly this is not true.
Right.
The second would be a sufficient cause. So that would mean if I gain size, then by it being a sufficient cause, if I gain size, then I gain strength. And that would mean, I don't know, somebody can chop my tendon in half and still gain strength, which clearly isn't true. But yeah, something along those lines. But clearly,
or just for a less extreme example, like if someone has been doing a lot of heavy singles in training, and then they start doing like a bunch of low load blood flow restriction training, like their 1 rep max may go down in spite of their muscles getting bigger.
Yeah, it's a multi-component thing, right? So like if I have 3 income streams, right, to a bank account, and the largest one goes up, but my 2 smaller ones go down, my net income might go up, even though my 2 smaller income streams go down, just to kind of think about it in a very simple sense.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So just briefly, the way that we model these things within biomechanics and engineering is every single component of the model is multiplicative. So if one goes down a little bit, that's going to affect a lot of the other things.
So they're interrelated.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not an additive model, it's a multiplicative one. And the last cause that we discuss is a contributory cause, for which we argue hypertrophy to be. And that is essentially that all else given equal, hypertrophy will increase strength. But the problem is that all else isn't equal. So in that case, it's extremely difficult to measure experimentally. And in order to measure something like that experimentally, ideally you have some sort of experiment where you can put hypertrophy in as an input and measure strength as an output. But we can't just assign people to get different amounts of hypertrophy. We have to give them a training program from which hypertrophy and strength arise together. So it's extremely difficult. It's a difficult question, and I think it's impossible to solve experimentally. And I think it's something that we have to really think about, go back to first principles, and approach from a cross-disciplinary and multimodal way. So that would combine modeling and different experimental approaches.
Love it. I would love to see work done in this area that kind of follows that trend. That would be a very effortful and intelligent approach to something that we probably already know and doesn't matter that much. And that's exactly what we're about here at Iron Culture. So beautiful. Anything else you two want to clarify, point out, or make sure that is covered before we give you the opportunity to shout out where people can learn more about you?
Not really. So one thing that we haven't put on the table yet that I guess is just worth getting on the table is that so far we've been talking about changes in size versus changes in strength, but I think that there is also some value in just looking at the correlation between muscle size and strength in populations where theoretically all of those other factors that contribute should be more or less held constant. So here I'm thinking like elite level strength athletes. You assume that if someone's world class, they probably have good normalized muscle force. They probably don't have garbage muscle insertions. Like all of those, they're probably pretty good at the lifts they're competing at. You assume that all of those things are mostly taken care of. So I think that in those populations, when you look at the relationship between muscle size and strength, you get a pretty decent idea of what the relationship between those two factors are when everything else is more or less held constant. And in a considerable amount of research now, we see that that's just a tremendously strong relationship. So I think one of the first studies looking at that was by Brachua and Abe in like national and world-class powerlifters. The correlation between fat-free mass per centimeter of height and strength in the squat, bench, and deadlift, the R value there was hovering around like 0.9. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the researcher's name, but you made me aware of a study, Eric, in junior world-class weightlifters, where the correlation between lean body mass and strength, I believe in the front squat and clean and jerk, was like 0.85, 0.9, the R value there. So I think that is clearly not directly answering the question of change in size versus change in strength, but I do think that it's at least an instructive relationship to point out to make sure that people are aware of. Because I think that, again, in those populations, a lot of those factors that do absolutely contribute to strength and vary tremendously between individuals are at least theoretically pretty similar between individuals in those studies. So I think it gives us a pretty clean look at what that relationship, quote unquote, should be.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. The variation should be way less just by process of elimination. And man, correlation does not equal causation, but when you're looking at humans and biological models, when you see something that explains 80% of the variation, you'd know they're probably linked in some way. Yeah. And it's definitely a useful hypothesis generating finding for sure. Awesome. Appreciate that.
And to build on that, there's an even older study that was in Science in like 1956, Litsky, something like that, where they looked at weightlifters, Olympic weightlifters, I think, and body weight. And they didn't report the R squared, but just looking at the plot, it looks like it's right about 1. And they used allometric scaling for that, which also has a theoretical foundation. So I would like to point out that from a first principles perspective, the idea is it's forces in parallel add, so that if you have more forces that are acting in parallel with one another, that is more sarcomeres in parallel, those should add together, and that this doesn't come from an EMG study in the 70s. This is a theory that's grounded in physics, not just applied exercise science. And other than that, I don't think I have anything else to add.
Awesome. So when you get bigger, it makes you stronger. It's physics, bro. That's what we're going to end on right there.
Auspicious moment.
Absolutely. Greg Knuckles, where can people find you? Thanks so much for coming on and your contributions. If people want to hear more from the bearded man, where do they go?
We understand you have a new podcast talking about meth.
Yeah, so strongerbyscience.com, website, free content, new podcast with Eric Trexler, pretty sick. You can go to sbspod.com. If you want to check out Mass, that's mine and Eric Helms and Mike Zordos's monthly subscription service. That is strongerbyscience.com/mass. If you want to follow me on social media, Facebook is where I kind of post about lifting, and Instagram is where I post pictures of food and recipes and my dog. And that's about it.
Thank you so much. Andrew, how about you? Where can people find out more about your research?
My Google Scholar profile has quite a bit. Same with my ResearchGate. Also, I'm on Twitter. I'm not extremely active on social media, but I do post every now and then. So my Twitter is @Vygotsky, and my Facebook is just my name. Also, I have a website. I've been meaning to write more, and hopefully now that I'm finished with my qualifying exam and things will slow down a bit, hopefully I'll get back to writing, and that's just andrewvygotsky.com.
Awesome. And when are you slated to potentially finish your PhD?
Hopefully 2021. We'll see, though.
Nice. That's not far off, man. Well, awesome. Well, thank you very much. Good luck in the rest of your studies. We all appreciate the work you both do. And to sign us out, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Omar.
I thought
the best outro in the game.
Yeah, I thought when you asked Andrew where can people find you, I thought he was going to say in about 10 hours nowhere because I'm going to be MIA. These bodies are getting warm and I got to get the hell out of here. So this is my last public appearance ever. But we want to thank both of these guests for hopefully illuminating the topic as it relates to strength and hypertrophy. I think they did a fantastic job talking about the theoretical considerations as well as practical implications for everyone listening, as well as can possibly be discussed on this complex topic. I just want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of Iron Culture, the podcast that continues to grow. We want to get maximally jacked with minimum function. You can help us out by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, on YouTube. If you enjoyed the video, if you enjoyed this episode, cool, give it a like. If you didn't, for whatever reason, hey, go ahead. We will respond to comments, and we'll see everyone in that next episode every single Monday.